The basic idea is to begin not with what you know about a text, because you aren't going to know very much before you read it. That's going to be true, first of all, because you haven't read it yet. That's true of every text I read. I haven't read it yet. And it's also going to be true because, for the most part, you're entering into a world of discourse, a world of writing and conversation that you're just not an expert in, right? And this happens especially to me when I read things outside my core area of expertise. I'm not a biblical scholar. I'm not a chemist, right? So when I read those things, what I'm able to do is not so much know things about the text, but I am able to notice things. So the idea is to give you a way to structure what you notice and to move from noticing things to knowing things. We're going to move from noticing things to figuring out like what mysteries the text presents us with that we can solve, and what it is that a text is trying to do. So let me share this form with you. This is a form that we'll be using. You'll get paper copies of it. I encourage you to use the paper copies. So as a quick overview, you'll see it has 6 boxes: terms, main ideas, mysteries, maps, and then 2 other boxes at the bottom that are sort of aside, that I'll talk about in a minute, that are connections and parking lot. The first 4, terms, main ideas, mysteries, and maps, relate to each other in a pretty clear way. And the other 2 are also important, but they don't really have as clear a linear relationship. So I'm going to start here with terms. So it can be useful to make a list of terms that you don't understand when you encounter a reading, that you would like to look up, that you need to figure out what they mean. But this form, this column that says terms, is not for every possible term you don't understand. That can become overwhelming, especially in a text with lots of those terms, maybe because it's a specialized vocabulary that you're not familiar with. It may even be words in foreign language. If your experience is like mine, it means that reading for understanding is an exercise in triage, in prioritizing the most urgent things that you need to know, which may not involve looking up every word. We just don't have time for that. So instead of thinking of this column here for terms as a place to list every possible term you think is a candidate, not a term for listing every possible term you don't understand. It's specifically a list of possible candidates for the next column, which is main ideas. I'll say more about that column in a minute, about how you might figure out which terms are the ones you want to list here. But let me start with how you figure out like what makes a good candidate for terms. And all of the things I'm going to tell you are ways you can notice the potential importance of a term without knowing what it means or what an author is using it to mean, because they might have a really particular way that they use it. This is not every possible way you can know that, but here are some ideas. So if a term appears in the title and then again in the text, I would say that's a good candidate for a main idea, and I would put that here in my terms box. If the author takes time in the text to define a term, if they've gone to that sort of trouble, probably it's a good candidate to put here in the terms box. If a term appears both at the beginning in the introductory section and at the end in the conclusion, it's probably a good candidate for terms. If a text has an index and you look in the index and something is used a lot, especially if it's sort of an obscure term that's used a lot, if you have a whole book, then you can look at the index. What terms come up a lot? And again, you don't need to know the meanings of any of these terms or how it fits in. It might even determine a foreign language. that you don't speak, but you could tell based just on these sort of structural facts about a term that it's a potentially important term or idea to wrap your head around if you're trying to get a sense of what the reading is about. Now let's move to this next column, to main ideas. Once you've got something of a list of terms, you can take a look at that and really start to figure out which of those terms are the main ideas. Depending on the length and complexity of the readings, you might have 5, 10, 20 terms listed, and you might have good reasons for thinking they are candidates for main ideas, but probably not all of them are. You have to figure out which ones are really important. I'm not going to say a lot at this stage about how we figure that out because we're going to do a lot of that in class. But just so you know, this column, main ideas, are a place to keep track of that. The number of terms on your main ideas list will probably be fewer than the number on the terms list. You'll see here that this says what terms seem important to get onto your maps. Don't worry about that. You'll understand that in a minute when we get to maps. The next column is mysteries. These are things you want to know about the text or things you may want to understand, that you may need to know to understand what the text is saying. But there's a little bit of nuance here that, that we'll talk about where to put questions that are sort of the speculative questions, right? Those are maybe more for the connections box. What goes in this column are things you think the text itself will answer if you just keep examining the text. That is, it's not a mystery about the world or about something else outside the text that you would need stuff outside the text to answer. It's something you think the text itself will tell you with further investigation of the text. So as an example, think of the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Now, there might well be some interesting mysteries that that text raises for you. Like it might raise for me the question of what sorts of climate a bear can live in. But if you've started to read the story, if you're filling out this column of mysteries for that story, there's nothing about the story, nothing in the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears that has led you to believe that you need to know about the climate in order to really understand the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And it's also not something that the story has led you to think that the story itself will answer. It might be a very interesting question, the question of the relationship between bears and climate. But it's not something that you have good reason to believe that the story itself is going to tell you with further investigation. But when the story starts off and says, once upon a time there were three bears, you may well write in here as a mystery, what is the relationship between the three bears? Because further reading of the story may well tell you that, and it may be important to understanding how the story works. So this column, mysteries, is to the right of terms and main ideas. Because one big kind of mystery you're going to encounter is how the main ideas relate to each other. This is another thing we'll talk about in class and practice as a way of learning how to do it. But in this column, one of the kinds of mysteries you'll make note of is trying to figure out those relationships. You'll say, how does term X, how does main idea X relate to main idea Y? And not every combination of main ideas is an important mystery. Some mysteries are more central than others. So you're going to be, again, doing triage, prioritizing. And as you move things from terms to main ideas to mysteries, you're going to hone closer and closer and closer to the central ideas and how they relate. So in all of this, something important to keep in mind is that this is a provisional document. These are working notes, and you'll probably change your mind, you'll cross stuff off, you'll erase. When we do this on the whiteboard in class, you'll see I do a lot of erasing and moving around and trying again. This is not the kind of notes where what you end up with is like a really clean document of the kind you might make if you're like studying for an exam, where you want everything to be exactly right, right? This is a place for figuring out on paper. You'll probably decide you were wrong or want to articulate it a different way. And that's okay, right? None of this is perfectly linear. This is a way to give some shape to your thought, to help you move from noticing things in a text, which is within everybody's capacity, to being able to sketch out what its central point is. I think that's what this next column does. Maps. That's the place where you sort of actually draw out in a visual way or bringing key ideas together in a couple of sentences. This one is much, much easier to explain by actually doing. So we're going to do that in class. I'm not going to explain it now. The only thing I want to say about it now is that, again, it's to the right of mysteries, main ideas, and terms, because the mysteries of how these terms relate are something you're gonna try to map out. Okay, so down here at the bottom are two other boxes. On one side is what I've called the parking lot. This is for other things you notice that may well be important or you have a personal interest in, but there's just not another good place to put it. Like I personally find architecture really fascinating. So I'm always like making notes in my parking lot about like buildings and like the architecture and right, like nobody else has to care about that, but I want to track it because it's important to me. Over here is a place for connections. And I think of connections as having three main kinds. There might be others, but three main kinds: to personal experience, to other texts, and to things in the world. Again, this will become more clear with our practice together in class. But one thing I want to say now is that sometimes connections are about agreement or sympathy or sharing the same main idea, or they may share some sort of method. But sometimes they're also about contrast or opposition, right? Two things are in disagreement. That's a kind of connection, a kind of relationship. The point is not texts that agree, it's that you could talk about them together in a productive way. So that's the very beginning of our introduction to this format that you'll see in our syllabus as TMIMM notes. This format is going to be something of a constant companion throughout the semester, and I hope it will be helpful. I'll ask you to try it out for a while and reevaluate, and we'll talk more about it. Thanks for going through this with me, and we'll talk about it in class. Thanks.